Welcome to Jimmy Carter, the Inside Story, with your anchor, Brandon Berger, and reporters Shane Peterson and Trent Walters, and a bunch of other guys that don't really matter as much. Let's go to our anchor, Brandon Berger!
Interrupt your regularly scheduled cooking program to bring you this live documentary about James Earl Carter. President Carter was elected into office in 1976 after President Gerald Ford. After his inauguration, Carter made the ceremonial trip down Pennsylvania Avenue, from the Capitol to the White House. He did it in a unique way, though. Here is a reenactment of that trip. We bring you live to Shane Peterson.
Thanks, Brandon. Well, Carter was a very different president. Most presidents, when they were elected, took a limousine to the White House. Sort of like this. Carter, on the other hand, and his family, said, "No thank you, limousine, I think we'll walk." And he proceeded to walk all the way to the White House with the crowd. He was a very different president. Like, when he arrived at places, he refused to have "Hail to the Chief" played. Back to you, Brandon.
Well, that was very intriguing, Shane, and thank you. Well, we now go to another reporter, Trent Walters, for Challenges Facing the Nation.
Jimmy Carter said one thing America wanted to hear. He said, "I will never lie to you." A day after being sworn in as a president, he tried to heal the wounds of the past. Carter fulfilled one of his campaign promises by issuing a pardon to thousands of men who had avoided the draft during the war in Vietnam.
Although Carter said anything America wanted to hear, he also had two major problems on his hands: the economy and the energy crisis. We now go to Ron Burgundy in the field for this report.
Thanks, Brandon. Like you said, Carter had two major problems: the economy and the energy crisis. Inflation and unemployment stood at unacceptably high levels. Carter definitely tried to do as much as he could to address both of these concerns. During his time, he added many new jobs to help boost the economy, but he was unable to bring down inflation, so the problem just seemed to get worse. As for the energy crisis, his goals were to ease dependence on foreign oil through energy conservation by developing new energy supplies and loosening government regulations on the American oil industry. To help develop and carry out his new policies, he pushed for the establishment of a new cabinet-level Department of Energy.
Thank you for that awesome report, Ron. Wow, Carter did a lot of amazing things. Let's figure out what he did in the real world, foreign policy.
When Jimmy Carter came into office, he had not had any foreign policy experience. Carter brought his own ideas to the field of foreign affairs. Carter brought new people, among them Andrew Young, an African American with a background in the civil rights. He served as an American ambassador to the United Nations.
Foreign policy sure is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Now we take you to John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt with environmental concerns during Carter's presidency.
Thanks, Brandon. Environmental concerns in Carter's presidency were very wide. Carter believed that conserving fuel was key to avoid mounting pressure to plunder the environment. He passed the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act. This protected more than 100 million acres in Alaska. Carter wasn't without environmental crisis, though. In 1970, 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant had a mishap. This resulted in a release of radiation, and although no one was hurt, public opinion about nuclear power grew rapidly. Back to you.
One of the most important things of President Carter's presidency was the Camp David Accords. Bringing you this footage now live is our reporter in the field number 2, Trent Walters.
The Camp David Accords. Carter's greatest foreign policy achievement centered on the long-standing conflict between Israel and Egypt, the two nations that fought frequently in recent decades. Fighting had occurred in 1967 in the Yom Kippur War in the aftermath of the 1973 war. Israel still occupied Egyptian territory on the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt still did not recognize Israel's right to exist. These were just some of the issues dividing the nations. In 1978, Carter invited Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to explore solutions to their bitter divisions. The meeting took place at Camp David, a president retreat located in Maryland. At this meeting, Carter painstakingly guided Sadat and Begin to a historic agreement. This came to be known as the Camp David Accords. For their efforts, Begin and Sadat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979.
Wow, that was a great story about the Camp David Accords. Very compelling and rich. Now we are bringing you live with another reporter in the field. What's your name?
Joe!
Okay, Joe. I guess you're doing international crises.
Thanks, Brandon. In 1978, the government of Afghanistan was taken over. The communist leaders were friendly with the Soviet Union. But the Soviets later invaded Afghanistan in 1979. This caused great anxiety in the U.S. The attack not only threatened the U.S., it also questioned Carter's ability to respond effectively to Soviet aggression. Carter's national security advisor summed up the problem in a memo to the president days after the invasion. Soviets' decisiveness, he wrote, will be contrasted with our resistance, which will no longer be labeled as prudent but increasingly as timid. Back to you, Brandon.
I don't think that was the whole story, Joe. Why don't you do your job and tell us the rest of it?
I guess you're right, Brandon. Carter also decided in response that he would put an embargo on grain going into the Soviet Union. He also decided to boycott the Olympics. This is a very bold move. And although it hurt the Soviets, it hurt the Americans just as much, and it made Carter appear weak in the eyes of many Americans.
Thanks for finishing that story, Joe. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special report for you tonight. We have the only live footage ever of the Iranian hostage crisis. Warning. This footage may not be suitable for children under the ages of 18.
We're here live in Tehran on November 4th, 1979. This mob has been attacking the American embassy for quite some time now. They've captured several dozen American employees. It is very clear to me now that Iran's leaders must be supporting this attack. Back to you.
What that reporter has failed to mention is what events led up to this dramatic scene. Iran came under the control of an Islamic religious leader known as Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini preached a strongly anti-American message. In October 1979, the American government allowed the Shah to enter the United States of America to receive treatment for his cancer. This action enraged many Iranians and has led to the events you have just seen. Back to you.
Just wait. What that reporter failed to mention is how it all panned out. President Carter appeared powerless to the end of the Iranian hostage crisis. His efforts to negotiate the safe return of the hostages went nowhere. He then approved a military mission to rescue the hostages. This failed tragically. When mechanical problems led to a helicopter crash that killed 8 soldiers, the senses of smoldering American wreckage in the Iranian desert hurt Carter's chances for re-election.
Well, that was some great three-way reporting. Well, thank you for joining us on this edition of Carter, the Real President. Stay tuned for next week's edition of Obama, the Great or the Greatest.